Okay, and I think we are all good to go. I just want to do a quick sound check. I see that we can see the panelists. Peter, can you confirm that you can hear us too on the back end before we get started? If you just want to chat. Yep, we're all good. Okay, and we have Sophia and Tia here. Hi, do you guys want to say something just to check your audio really quick before we get started?
Hi.
Good morning.
Hey, okay, we are all good. Okay, so we will get started. So I think people are still trickling in right now. And we also are recording this, so anyone on here, this will be available to send out to folks if you want to share it with people later on. Hopefully we'll have that sometime over the weekend or early next week. So we'll dive right in for this panel, which we are calling Future Meets Past, and it's all about activism going back to the first Earth Day in 1970, which is often credited with being really the birth of the modern environmental movement, up to climate activism today. Obviously, climate activism and climate action has really become top of mind for a lot of people in recent years. It has broken through to the mainstream in a way that I think we haven't really seen in the last few decades, which is really exciting if it does actually lead to progress. But we're gonna chat about this today. First, let's do some quick intros. I always find that people are better at introducing themselves than me reading off of some paper of a bio. So Tia, do you want to start out just with a quick intro of yourself, the work that you do related to the subject today?
Oh, sure. Good morning, John, and I'm delighted to be here with Sophia and with your audience. Thanks for organizing this. I am speaking to you from my home in Madison, Wisconsin, where I was born. I grew up in DC and studied wildlife ecology and have been working in environmental policy since I graduated from college, which was an extremely long time ago, maybe 4 decades or more. I became director of the Nature Conservancy's Global Climate Change Initiative, and during that work I attended many of the UN climate talks. I was in Rio de Janeiro when George Herbert Walker Bush signed the Framework Convention on Climate Change at the Earth Summit, saying that he was pledging the United States to lead the world in addressing the existential crisis of climate change. So I've been on this beat for a long time. I took a break from climate change advocacy and worked for a little more than a decade at the Wisconsin Public Lands Commission. And now I'm at the Outrider Foundation, where I run their climate programs. And I focus a lot on how to be more effective in communicating to folks beyond the choir and beyond those of us who get up in the morning and think of ourselves as environmentalists, and communicate to a broader audience that we know what the climate solutions are, and that it's urgent that we act. So we run a variety of climate communications programming at Outrider, and it's challenging but rewarding work.
Good. Thank you so much, Tia. Really happy to talk about this with you today. You obviously have a great perspective going back to the work with your father, and then everything you described there. It's obviously super pertinent. And Sophia, do you want to say a few words introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Sophia Kiani. I'm an 18-year-old Iranian-American climate activist. I'm currently in McLean, Virginia. So I'm the founder and executive director of Climate Cardinals, which is a youth-led international nonprofit with over 6,000 volunteers. And our mission is really to make the climate movement more accessible to people who don't speak English. It was really inspired by my own experience translating climate information for my relatives in Iran. And I was most recently selected to represent the United States as the youngest member on the United Nations Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change.
Great, thank you so much. And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm John Opperman, Executive Director of Earth Day Initiative, we're a nonprofit organization that organizes large-scale Earth Day events, kind of using that gateway that Earth Day provides every year to catch people, not just preaching to the choir, but it's the one day a year that everyone really wants to do something. So we've always viewed it as a sort of gateway. One of our early leaders called it the gateway drug into the environmental movement, and that you go to an Earth Day event, you discover something that resonates with you, and then you do a little more and a little more and a little more, and hopefully it's a way to get you hooked. And we have a variety of programs. You can check us out at dojustonething.org. That's do just one with the number one thing.org. We just launched a podcast. You can find out about it there, the Parts Per Million podcast, talking all about social activism and what you can do in your own life. So there's a lot of information there. Also, I'm a sort of green communications consultant. So I'm really interested in the conversation today, particularly about how we best communicate climate to the broader public. And I think right now, if we could, we're going to try to work this out logistically. This is the first panel of the day, so we might have a few technical glitches, but we'll see. So Peter, could you run this video that Tia was a part of? It's a quick trailer, and we're going to see if this works.
Our goal is not just an environment of clean air and water and scenic beauty while forgetting about the worst environments in America.
This movement and this fight is about all of us. I think for me, Earth Day now is about getting back to our roots.
The youth movement has been energized in the last year in ways that resemble what was happening when the first Earth Day occurred.
There comes a place where activism drives even the crustiest old-timer to decide to get involved.
Environmentalism is not a partisan issue. Environmentalism is a quality of life issue.
Our goal is an environment of decency, quality, and mutual respect for all human beings and all other living creatures.
We're at a critical moment in history. We have an opportunity to address the greatest environmental challenge of our time.
Thank you, Peter. So Tia, can we kick things off by, can you just say a little bit about the film? People can check out the larger film. We can distribute that link. How long is the larger film? It's pretty short.
Yeah, the film is 7 minutes. It has archival footage of my father speaking on the eve of the first Earth Day. My father, Gaylord Nelson, was Earth Day founder. Has archival footage of Papa. And then I recruited Varshini Prakash, the co-founder of the Sunrise Movement, and Bob Inglis, a former Republican congressman, evangelical Christian, and founder of an organization called Republic EN, working with conservatives to do a call to action on climate change. I thought Varshini and Bob's voice were the perfect sort of bookends to honor my father, his legacy, his vision on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Obviously, it's very personal for me. But I didn't want to just honor the past and honor my father, though as important as that is and was to me for this 50th anniversary. I wanted people to see the sense of hope and optimism that came, the actions that followed from that, and through Varshini and Bob's voice to recognize that my father's call to action was multi-generational, it was bipartisan, and it had a strong social justice element that in recent times, the environmental community is embracing more fully, but I think that part of his message, which he delivered, 50 years ago, ecology is a big science, not a narrow science. It involves the worst environments in America and the inner city and Appalachia. These are his words, and that part of his call to action, in my view, wasn't heard and embraced in the manner that it should have been. But I really wanted people to, if nothing else, come away after watching that film and realize that individual action matters, that my father worked for many years and suffered a lot of setbacks to reach a point where he had a successful message that galvanized the country. 20 million people gathered on that day, the largest secular event in American history. It was successful beyond his wildest dreams. And I hope that people will take a moment to watch the film and feel a sense of inspiration from the unknowable power that each of us, and the unimaginable power that each of us have to make a difference.
Yeah, and I do recommend anyone to view the film. It is really interesting, just setting that historical context for the breadth of the history of the environmental movement. We are celebrating the 50th anniversary of Earth Day this year, so it is a good time to look back, look at the lessons learned. Sophia, I'm curious, so as a pretty young climate activist, what is your perception of that history? So how do you view that history going back to 1970, you know, well before you were born, like in terms of both the legacy in positive ways that it has laid, and like what are the things that just top of mind as a young activist that we need to correct from that earlier movement?
I mean, I definitely think it's so important to honor the legacy of all the climate activists who have come before me. Obviously, Tia has done amazing work, and so has her father. And I definitely think that there's been too much narrative recently of like the older generation versus the younger generation. And I honestly don't really believe that. I think there's so much value in really working together and seeing how we can come together to further the progress, obviously, because there's so much that is left to be done. And in terms of reckoning with the climate movement and its legacy, I definitely agree that there hasn't been enough focus on social justice. And I think that that's definitely a new development that we've seen, that we now understand that the links between racial justice and climate justice are undeniable, and they really need to be at the forefront of our minds when we are designing specific policy recommendations, and really also being mindful of whose voices we're centering in climate discussions. Who do we want to elevate? We want to make sure that people who have experiences with climate injustice, with racial injustice, with environmental racism, these people who have firsthand experienced the effects of how our system has really neglected certain people, they need to be at the forefront of the climate movement, really talking about their experiences and making sure that we don't neglect those voices again, and that we don't neglect those communities when we're coming up with climate solutions.
Yeah. And that touches on, both of you have touched on something that we spoke about the other day, just that climate justice element and the inclusion and diversity element. So it's obviously been a conversation, as you said, Tia, going back decades. Why do we think, I mean, I have my own opinions on this and I want to hear from both of you, but why, given that that has been top of mind for a lot of people going back to the beginning, just why have we not really seen that in terms of really including the voices that are actually the most impacted, and decisions wind up being made by more privileged people rather than the people that we said from the beginning? A lot of us environmental activists have said from the beginning that we wanted to have more representation.
Yeah, John, I wish I knew the answer. As you're well aware, you know, for a very long time, the environmental movement has been seen largely as the province of affluent European Americans, and in spite of the obvious harm and hardship that has disproportionately impacted poorer communities that my father talks about in his first Earth Day speech. And I don't, you know, it's hard. I think it probably the answer to the question would be the same answer you would get for why disadvantaged communities, underrepresented communities haven't had a seat at the table of power for any number of issues far beyond the environment. It's not just the environmental movement. It's been a systemic failure of our democracy, really, and it is beginning to change and really important ways that give me a sense of optimism for more rapid change. I'll leave it at that. I'd love to hear what Sophia thinks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a long time, the racial justice issue was kind of left out of the climate conversation, or at least not that it was left out, it just wasn't stressed enough. People were more so just talking about, yeah, like we have to lower emissions, but they weren't thinking, oh, where are these like oil refineries? Where are all these facilities that are emitting like toxic waste? Where are they placed? And they weren't really talking about how they were placed in minority communities and disproportionately impacting those minority communities. And so now I think that especially young people have just been stressing this fact that now that we know about these issues, now that they're being covered more by the press and the media, we need to make sure that we're not just talking about it, but we're actively making sure that we're including these voices in discussions. And I think that also, like, we've just seen a pattern for so many years of activists really being painted as this white upper like middle class like older person who is privileged and they have the time and the resources to dedicate to advocating for these causes. But I think really we've changed this discussion where everyone can be an activist. Anyone can be an activist. If you're passionate about an issue, you should be talking about it, and anyone can be talking about it. And it's not just like a white, rich, privileged person who has a platform, because now I think we have finally understood that we shouldn't just be passing the platform to people who are famous and who have this influence, which usually tends to be white people. But we actually realize, especially like in terms of the media and other influential, powerful people, that there is so much value in passing your platform and passing media attention to people that typically wouldn't get media attention before, just because they don't have the same level of power and influence.
And John, it was just a few years before the first Earth Day that the Civil Rights Act was passed, right? But when my father was elected to the United States Senate, there was a single woman and a single African American that had been elected around that time. And so, that's the institutional barriers to participating have been in place a long time, and we've been breaking them down for a long time. I reflect a lot on, I reflect a lot on this period of awakening that we're in right now, this sense of cultural and social fracturing that we're experiencing right now. And that there are parallels to what was happening in the 60s. There was great civil and social unrest over an unjust and unwinnable war in Vietnam. There was great conflict and leading up to and after the adoption of the Civil Rights Act. My hero, who sat next to my father in the United States Senate, who talked so brilliantly about social and racial justice, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, was assassinated while running for president. This was months after Martin Luther King had been assassinated. All of these things were happening in 1968. I was 10 years old, approximately. The first Earth Day happened when I was 12. We haven't been through such an awakening in a very long time. But there are, we've experienced similar moments in history, and there's lessons to be learned from that.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that, Tia, because that's actually something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, and we've actually been talking about quite a bit on the Parts Per Million podcast. That's kind of the theme of looking at social movements, and the idea that I feel like it is a lot of people's experience, and it at least is my experience, that so often it feels like social change, when it happens, it can just feel like it happens like that. And that's obviously not true, because whether it's the civil rights movement, it's gay rights, it's climate change, whatever it is, it's obviously the work of decades of activists really beating that drum and moving things forward slowly and incrementally and really pushing for more ambitious change. But then when it does come, that was my experience, and I feel like other people's experience, for instance, with marriage equality, it feels like things can just rush, but it's not really that case. So what we're looking at on the Parts Per Million podcast is, how do these things happen? Like, what is the science behind how do social movements form, and then how do they interact? And what you're talking about was this very activist age that existed in the late 60s leading into the first Earth Day in 1970. This is something that I talk to a lot of people about whenever I give talks about activism and the history of Earth Day and all that, that in my mind, breaking it down in very simplistic terms, obviously way oversimplifying the whole thing, it was just this perfect storm of factors. And if I'm just picking out three, it's one, that it was a very activist age, that people were turning out for the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and then the environmental movement. It was just, people were really engaged at that time. Also, there had been the work of decades of activists and journalists sort of raising the alarm about environmental challenges, going back to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, raising the alarm about pesticides, and people really building that groundwork, that fertile soil of awareness amongst the public about our environmental challenges. And then the third thing in my mind was the current events, the news of the day, the environmental catastrophes that happened with the Cuyahoga River fire and the Santa Barbara oil spill, for instance, that really sparked the public's imagination. And in my mind, none of those factors alone would have really set the spark to create that birth of the environmental movement, with the largest event in, I don't know if it's, I always thought it was human history. It's 20 million people across the country for one event in its first year. That's a mind-boggling number of people, considering that was 10% of the population of America at the time. So in my mind, none of those events by themselves would have lit that spark. And I think evidence of that is the Cuyahoga River fire. That, for anyone who's not aware of what that was, the Cuyahoga River was so polluted that it would catch fire, like the surface of the water would burn. And that really caught people's attention, the public's attention, caught national headlines. But what I think is interesting is that was not the first time that this river caught on fire. It was so polluted that it would just catch on fire periodically. And the citizens in the area were like, oh, the river's on fire again. And they were just used to it. And that's why I view it as a sort of perfect storm moment, where it was all of those factors, the activist age, the awareness building that had been done by activists for decades, and then these natural, or not natural disasters, but environmental catastrophes, very much man-made environmental catastrophes, lit that spark. And that's why I always describe it as a sort of perfect storm of factors that came together. And that's how I kind of view things today with the climate movement and the Black Lives Matter movement and various things that are sort of changing people's awareness today. With the climate movement, I see the work of decades of activists building that awareness. I see it a very activist age, especially under this administration. People are turning out for all kinds of different causes, March for Our Lives, the Women's March, the March for Science. And then the really awful events tied to climate change that we see with wildfires and droughts and superstorms and all of these things. And it's those three factors, again, that in my mind seem like we could just be on the cusp of really breaking through on awareness, very similar to the first Earth Day. I'm really curious to hear your all's perspective on that. Do you think that we're in that sort of perfect storm moment potentially? And also how all of these movements are related, where it's like, it's not a coincidence that climate and the Black Lives Matter movement are happening at relatively the same time?
Yes, well, it's interesting that you mentioned the Cuyahoga River had caught fire multiple times before, but it's often referenced in talking about the Earth Day history. The Santa Barbara oil spill, interestingly enough, my father came up with the idea for what it was before it was called Earth Day. He called it Environmental Teach-In Day. Thank goodness. Mm-hmm. They changed the name, the organizers changed the name. He had gone to Santa Barbara to look at that oil spill, which was the largest oil spill in American history at the time. And and he was reading Ramparts magazine on the plane, and the cover story was about how youth activists on college campuses had changed the national discourse on the morality of the Vietnam War through protest and through what were called anti-war teach-ins. And so he said, okay, that model seems to work. I need the energy of youth to bring to fruition my dream I mean, keep in mind, there was no Clean Air Act, there was no Clean Water Act. There was no Environmental Protection Agency to protect our rights to breathe clean air and drink clean water. That was signed into law by Republican President Richard Nixon. My father inspected the oil spill and had this idea, reading this article about the power of youth on campus to change the discourse on the war, and said, that's it, I'm going to call for a teach-in on the environment. And as I mentioned, it was successful beyond his wildest dreams. I've wondered a lot. Some people don't, rib me a little bit for this particular criticism, but symbolism is really important. You ask whether this is a unique, precipitous moment. I believe it. I truly believe it is. In part for because of the unfortunate fact that climate change is now in our backyard in a way that is visible, and in which people are experiencing, whether it's wildfire, more intense wildfires, more extreme weather events, or other factors. But, early on, you think of the polar bear as a symbol for climate change. To me, that was, it's not a great symbol to inspire people to care about something, and nothing against the polar bear, but that doesn't personalize the risk that climate change poses to all of us, to our health, to our children's future, to the well-being of our economy, and every element of what it's going to mean to live on this planet as the human species. And so, fortunately or unfortunately, or perhaps both at the same time, recent catastrophic climate events have brought it home in a way that didn't previously. And we, I'm at the UN meetings more than 25 years ago, and these predictions were being made but not seen, except for by a small group of sort of exclusive UN negotiators, big environmental organizations, and being led by the science. And it's not visible the way the burning Cuyahoga River is, or that catastrophic oil spill on the beautiful coast of Santa Barbara. These incidences of grave pollution were visible, and climate change has not been in a manner that it is now coming into focus. And I think that is changing the conversation in really significant ways.
Yeah, and Sophia, do you find that in terms of the people, especially young people who are getting involved, is it kind of the extreme weather events and the things that feel more visceral? I mean, I definitely saw that in New York City, where I'm located, that after Hurricane Sandy, a lot of people all of a sudden became climate activists, and they were coming from communities that had not typically been associated with climate activism, but all of a sudden feeling those local effects of global climate change seemed to bring people on board.
Well, kind of going back to your original question and touching upon what Tia mentioned about symbolism, I think that is very important. I think nothing is really a substitute for watching millions of people going out and striking to really get you to understand what an urgent matter this is. Especially if you go back last September 20th and 27th, when we had the global climate strikes that the youth had organized, especially Fridays for Future, there was over 7 million people that took part. And so when you have such a large mass gathering, that's when I think it really rings true for people, especially when it's such young people, okay, are like, this generation is so concerned for their future that they're willing to skip school and go out into the streets and really demand that the government takes action. And I think that's very, very powerful. And of course, also witnessing firsthand the effects of climate change, like, of course, what's happening in California right now with the wildfires. I'm sure for a lot of youth and for people there in general, it's very scary to realize that these events are being exacerbated by climate change, and that this is something that our government can take action on, but they're not. And so definitely firsthand experiencing the effects of climate change is going to be something that really like sparks motivation to want to get involved in the climate movement. And then secondly, just watching mass gatherings and mobilizations of people striking, I think also has a really powerful effect of making people realize how important this entire movement is.
Yeah. And also, I do want to mention, if any attendees do have questions or comments, you can use the Q&A feature, which for most of you will be at the bottom of your screen. If you just go down there and hit Q&A, you can send in a question or comment there. It might be different if you're dialed in by phone on the phone app. In terms of that sort of breaking through, so one thing is those actual concrete events that you can see and feel, and then it's whether it's the climate events or activists turning out in the streets, that's something that's very visceral too, that you can see. What about just communicating this stuff? What have you found is the language and the messaging that works in your own lives or in your work in terms of breaking through? For me, a lot of the climate communications work I do, whether it's communicating on climate or sort of sustainable, I have a whole thing on sustainable buildings and how we can better message green and healthy homes to people. It really is focusing, like you said, Tia, on the person. So it's not a polar bear. And it's like, stop talking about, like, stop throwing a leaf on something or throwing like a polar bear on something, because as much as people might care about that, that might not be the greatest motivator for them. And the example I always give of that is, I feel like the average person that buys organic food, yeah, they feel great about organic food being better for the environment, but what's actually motivating them is they probably have a belief that it's better for the health and wellness of them and their families. And whatever's like most personal is really the biggest motivator. Have you found that really focusing on the personal is the best thing? Or like, what kind of messages or language? There's a debate about, should we say green or should we say sustainable or climate? And for a long time, people were like, don't talk about climate, that's too abstract. And that's only changed recently. But what kind of language or messaging have you found is helpful both in your personal life and sort of the activist context?
Well, two of the most effective and brilliant climate communicators that I know and I follow and study very carefully are Dr. John Foley and Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. And there's a lot of great scientists, climate scientists in the world. They are particularly effective at communicating with the lay audience. And one of the things that I've learned is more effective is talking about personal impacts. And Katharine has this fabulous YouTube series called Global Weirding, where she answers any question you could possibly have on climate change. But she talks about connecting with people where they are. So I live in Wisconsin. I love the North Woods. Many of my friends there have a very close relationship with nature. Many of them are hunters or fishermen. The impact of climate change on trout in Wisconsin is going to be significant. I don't lead into a conversation with them talking about climate change. I lead in with a conversation about what they're seeing when they go fishing. Are they seeing changes on the landscape? So meeting people where they are is really important. My personal view is that finding unexpected messengers. So I've been at Outrider working with Brent Suter, the pitcher for the Milwaukee Brewers, who's launched a number of really interesting environmental initiatives and really walks the talk in his personal life. he reaches a group of people that I wouldn't reach. I'm not particularly interested in baseball. I'm not gonna, be a credible voice to a bunch of sports folks, but Brent is. It's why Bob English's voice has been so powerful he and I are gonna do a talk with the Citizen Climate Lobby in a couple of weeks. Bob can speak to conservatives. He can speak to Christians about, and so the finding the right messengers and the right messages. And in terms of the right message, I just feel very strongly, and the research we're doing at Outrider strongly bears out that if you talk about solutions, because we really do know what the solutions are. And John Foley's now at Project Drawdown. They've ranked the top 100 climate solutions. It's really, if you want a sense of hope that we can solve this, that's a great book to take a look at. Talking about solutions that are going to give us better public health outcomes, better outcomes for our children, better outcomes for our economy, and avoid being too preoccupied with the gloom and doom. I mean, the situation is extremely serious, and if you're a climate activist and don't have anxiety and depression around this issue, we all do. But focusing on the right messengers, meeting people where they are, talking about solutions, to me, those are three really important things to do. And that's where I focus a lot of my attention. Outrider has a climate solutions video series that we did with the Years Project using Yale's 6 Americas. I think it's really a false dichotomy to think that there's a liberal or a conservative mindset in some rigid place around this issue. There's really a diversity of views from the very alarmed. Climate deniers are actually a small fraction, according to the polling data from Yale. Talking to that middle segment and helping them understand that the solutions available to us create jobs, create a stronger economy, create better public health outcomes, and better outcomes for ourselves and our children. And that we know what we need to do. We just need to do it, and we need to do it with a sense of urgency.
Yeah. And actually, speaking of the Yale program on climate communications, we actually talked to Lisa Fernandez from the program on this week's episode of the Parts Per Million podcast, talking all about the 6 Americas, which I think is super fascinating. And one of the sort of poll quotes that we took from that is, most people don't realize that they're actually in the majority. Yeah. They think that there's a lot of skepticism about climate change, but people don't actually realize that most people are very concerned about climate change. And it's just that the deniers have such an outsized voice on the subject as we sort of make a dichotomy.
Yeah, before we go, I just want to, Catherine has a video just about talking about it, on that point, how important it is to talk about it, because people have become afraid to talk about it, thinking it's a polarizing issue, when the fact is the majority of Americans are concerned about climate change. So that Yale work is really fascinating, and they just released the latest poll, and I found it illuminating and hopeful in seeing really large percentage of Americans concerned about climate change and wanting a government response to address it.
Yeah, absolutely. So someone in the Q&A asked for the names. So one is Catherine Hayhoe, and I can't remember, who is the second person that you had mentioned the best at communicating?
Jonathan Foley.
Oh yeah, Jonathan Foley from Drawdown.
At Project Drawdown. Highly recommend that you follow both of them on Twitter. I've never seen two more effective climate communicators. There are others, but I can't name them all in this call, but those are two of my favorite. I'm great admirers of both of them. I'm honored to have relationships with both of them. And the thing that's inspiring me today, I just got yesterday my copy of this book, and it is edited by Dr. Catherine Wilkinson, who's at Project Drawdown, working with John Foley. All We Can Save is a compilation of stories, articles, and poems by women climate authors and activists, and really, really inspiring. And sat outside on the deck this morning and watched the hummingbirds feed, and read a few pieces to get inspired for today's conversation with you. And there's just a ton of really inspiring climate communication stuff in that book. And it just came out, and it's all women voices with a significant representation of voices that haven't often been included, and really powerful stuff.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that book is definitely making the rounds right now. I think people are really excited about it. And also I can second the endorsement for Katharine Hayhoe and Jonathan Foley. We had folks from Drawdown and Katharine Hayhoe involved in our virtual Earth Day 50 events, and they did really fantastic presentations. Yeah, Sophia, do you want to speak a bit about the communications and messaging that you have found most effective in breaking through to people?
Yeah, so I've been really interested in environmental and climate communication because that's kind of related to the work that I've been doing with Climate Cardinals, since we have to decide, you know, what sorts of climate research and information do we want to translate to distribute to the masses. And actually, like, interestingly, just last week, I had a chat with the director of the Yale Climate Communications Program, and that's really what he was stressing. He was saying how you need to, every like word that you use, it really needs to be directed at your audience. Obviously, you're going to be talking about something different if you're talking to a climate denier versus someone who believes in climate change but is just more apathetic. And so I definitely would second that. And actually, like, I would also say I don't like to use my time like talking to people who just don't believe in climate change in general, because I actually find that to be a very ineffective use of my time. I think it's a lot better to talk to people who believe in climate change, but who just haven't been taking the necessary steps to really advocate or take that step to become an activist and actually like start donating to organizations, start volunteering with organizations. But I've also been interning with the Stanford Environmental Neuroscience branch. And what they have found is that like they're actually creating an environmental lexicon right now of vocabulary to use surrounding climate change. And so there are a lot of terms, kind of like climate crisis, that are kind of political, or at least they're perceived as political by people like Republicans. And so there actually is sometimes like there's better ways to phrase arguments like we were talking about to your audience, but also if you're wanting to just say a general statement, sometimes it's better to err on the side of caution and not use politically charged language if you're just trying to reach the largest audience possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think both of you are talking about something that I really believe in, that it is, like I said, Lisa, from the Yale program on climate change communications, most people don't realize they're in the majority. So what we call it, we have this whole program at dojustonething.org where it's just be a climate communicator. Simply talking about it, any study shows that the most influential thing in anyone's life is just people that they know. So you are going to influence the people around you way better than some PSA or scientific study or whatever it might be is. So just simply talking about it goes a huge way to influencing people. And I think we've seen that with like the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, this summer, that the number of people coming out in support for the goals of the Black Lives Matter movement just made it so much more appealing to everyone else, where it's like, oh, well, my friends are really into that. That's something I'll actually educate myself about. And I think that we saw a big groundswell partly just because people started talking about it, which is great.
John,
go ahead.
Just on a personal note, I would be remiss if I didn't say that in a participatory democracy, the most important thing you can do is participate, and showing up in your communities and using your voice to express your values is very important, but showing up at the ballot box is critical. And this is going to be the most consequential election of our time on this issue. And it's no time to sit it out. I would be remiss for not saying that, and I'm just saying that from a personal perspective, and someone who spent their whole life in politics and seen how individual action and leadership can make a real difference and change the trajectory of history. My father did that, and I still believe in that power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, on that note, I think that's a good transition to a related subject. Where do you two see things going? Are you hopeful about where things are going in terms of climate action? Not diving into like specific policies and trying to make predictions on like this particular thing is going to happen, that particular thing, but are you generally hopeful about where we're going? Are you more than 50% hopeful or more than 50% sort of depressed?
Yes, well,
Maybe it depends on the day or the minute.
Well, it's certainly, for me, it's a bit schizophrenic, as I said at the top of our program. I've been at this a long time. So, and I was talking to a youth activist at the University of Wisconsin recently who's in the energy program there, and about how sad I was that at my age and in this moment in time, we are where we are. When I see and she said, well, you see the roads not taken, and I see the roads ahead of me, right? And so for an old combatant in this battle, and there are days that really get me down. I have to admit that. But I am hopeful in the sense that something is happening right now that it has not happened since I became a climate activist. That gives me a sense of hope. And further, we know that every half-degree warming, and Foley's brilliant at talking about this, every half-degree warming, additional half-degree warming matters, right? We are experiencing significant harm from climate change, but we can avert worse outcomes through actions that are going to bring us not just build a brighter future, but have very immediate positive impacts for the quality of our lives and our communities and our families and the natural environment around us. And I sense an energy and a focus and an intensity among climate activists today that I have not seen in the previous decades. And so that excites me. And on a good day, that's where I am.
I would say that it honestly depends on this election. I think that if Biden is elected, then yes, I do feel hopeful. I'm energized by his $2 trillion climate plan. These things make me excited, especially with the current like advances I've seen in the climate movement with so many people really wanting to get involved. And I know that like his administration will actually be receptive to pressure that climate activists will put on them. And then on the other side of the coin, you have Trump's administration, which very bluntly, no matter what we do, there's like, he's just going to keep undoing environmental regulation. And so I would echo what Tia was saying. This is so important. I just can't like express to my friends enough how important it is. I really want them to go out and vote, since I do know, especially young people, like we rightfully deserve flack for not going out and voting in large numbers. And so, I mean, this is my first general election voting. I'm so excited, but also so scared and nervous, because this really is the election of our lifetime. And I just really hope that we don't have to go through another 4 years of Trump, because I don't know if that's something that will be easy to undo.
And somewhat related to just our moment, I guess we couldn't have a panel in 2020 without addressing it, but how do you think COVID affects all of this? I had really mixed feelings when in the spring we had to pivot very quickly from in-person to virtual events for climate or for Earth Day 50 and for the climate movement and the impacts on that. And on the one hand, it seems like COVID could provide a roadmap for how we deal with a global challenge. Then we've seen how we've actually dealt with this global challenge, and it is not particularly encouraging to me. But how do you see COVID impacting it? Do you see it setting back the climate movement because everyone is so distracted by COVID, so somewhat rightfully so? Or do you feel like it could sort of galvanize people to deal with multiple crises at once?
Well, one thing it could do, and I hope it does, and there's still a chance that it will do, we don't we don't have a handle on COVID, and it will take global cooperation to get to be successful in doing that. It will take global cooperation to be successful in addressing climate change. And so it's possible that we can see ourselves as being a part of something larger than our sort of the tribal space that we occupy. It's possible that we don't. I just don't know. Everyone, I have nothing, I wish I had something pithy and wise to say to that question. I think there's so much that we don't know about the near-term future in terms of how we're going to manage that crisis. But one of the things that I think it did do on the positive side for the environmental movement is that quick pivot that you talked about for Earth Day, when all of these in-person events had to convert to virtual events. And was that a lot of new and even more sophisticated ways of organizing and communicating and finding ways to take action were formed. And there are more networks, they are stronger, they are more effective, and they're making a really big difference.
Yeah. And Sophia, do you want to close it out? Final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really surreal experience for me as a student. I mean, I'm doing everything virtual now, so I'll take a test, hop off, go on a panel, like talk on the phone with my fellow organizers about like new virtual campaigns and initiatives. It's definitely been really interesting, but I do think there are a lot of lessons we can learn from this. I mean, I started Climate Cardinals during quarantine, and we have gotten over 6,000, mostly young people. Average age of 16 is like one of our volunteers. So we have been able to mobilize so many people through the power of social media. And I definitely think that that is a lasting lesson that we're going to take with us, because no matter what happens, we are going to be using the internet to mobilize millions of people, whether that be for online actions or in-person actions. So all we can really do during this time is to be optimistic and realize that even though it's not an ideal situation, it's a horrible situation, we can at least use it in the best way possible.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think that is evidence that I have said maybe COVID, this whole period, is the age when the internet grows up. That, you know, I feel like we've all been very down on the internet, where it's just social media and it's all vapid and it's superficial. But in the last few months, we've actually really connected in really meaningful ways, I think. And it's opened up opportunities for us to do things like this, where we are in different locations. We're not doing a physical event in person. We did not have to fly everyone into one place on a day and time, but we can come together like this, which is really nice. And we do have to wrap it up, but thank you so much to both of you, Tia and Sophia. This was great. So we will share all of this out on Earth Day Initiative social channels at Earth Day Initiative and on our email list, and we'll share it to Sophia and Tia's organizations. So check it out there, and be well, everyone.
Thanks. I'm grateful, John. I'm grateful to you for your work, Sophia. Keep up it.
Thank you so much. It was so nice to meet you, and I'm so glad everyone tuned in. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.